and just really great to be on. Really excited to just introduce these incredible, prolific individuals, and just great to be in the space. And so, thank you, Ms. Reed. It would be great for folks to drop their names in the chat and follow suit as Pat Reed did for us already, just to know who's in the space. But as Reggie already stated today, we are joined in fellowship and conversation with Attorney Angus Thompson and Commissioner Leroy Johnson. Attorney Thompson is a Robeson, based in Robeson County here in North Carolina. Really proud to have a son of the state and legend here on the panel. But also Commissioner Johnson, son of Mississippi. Really great to also have him here to speak to us about, we're talking about redistricting. But one of the reasons we really wanted to bring these two, I consider them, legends, but to bring them into the space was to say, Southern Echo, which Commissioner Leroy Johnson was a part of co-founding, was a revolutionary institution, an organization that created fair redistricting models. And they'll talk more about that. I won't give too much away, but they created fair redistricting models for Mississippi. And I know Commissioner Johnson will talk about how they doubled the African American caucus, but they really got down the system of how to achieve fair representation. And other states, California with their fair redistricting model, that have, other states who have won fair redistricting, studied that model from Southern Echo, studied that model from the elders you see up here. And so tonight is about giving them honor, but also hearing about, what was their journey? What was the trials and tribulations, and just hearing them. Maybe they'll even grace us with some recommendations or thoughts or feedback. Attorney Thompson, a retired public defender and the first public defender in a rural county in North Carolina, the first public defender office in a rural county in Robeson County. Still the only one, I believe. Isn't that right, Attorney Thompson? Still the only one. And Attorney Thompson led that office. He'll talk about more about his history, but his involvement in the local redistricting in Robeson County was revolutionary. If folks listen into the last Code Red a workshop that Reggie referenced, we went over that historic win, how Robeson County achieved fair redistricting on all levels, local, state, congressional. This is one of the prolific individuals who was able to galvanize, be it through litigation, through policy and community as well, to achieve those wins. And so I'm gonna step back a little bit and just welcome again Commissioner Johnson and Attorney Thompson to the space. And I think what would be great is anything that I left out, anything that you would like to fill in for folks to get more context, please feel free. But the first question I really want us to go into is just what got you into the journey of redistricting politics. Let's just start and rewind a little bit before we get into what we're facing today, what the landscape is. Let's hear a little bit more. And so it's up to Commissioner Johnson or Attorney Thompson, who would like to go first. Totally up to your discretion.
Let me just say, this is Angus Thompson speaking. Let me say thank you first to Reggie and the Alliance and the consortium. And I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to talk about context. You mentioned that I was the first public defender in Robeson County, and we actually pronounce it Robeson, but others who are not from here, they say Robeson. So Robeson. But I wanted to let you know that my experience with redistricting actually came into being because of my position with the North Carolina Conference of State Branches, NAACP. In 1989, I became the general counsel for the North Carolina State Conference of Branches. I was very young. I was actually 2 years out of law school. And I served as general counsel until I became public defender of Robeson County. Excuse me, in 1989, I became public defender of Robeson County. In 1979, I became general counsel of the NAACP. So it was through my being general counsel of the NAACP that I got into the redistricting. And of course, I had statewide exposure. That was under the presidency of the late Kelly M. Alexander, and our national director was Ben Hooks. We're talking about in the 70s and early and 80s. And so that's the context in which I came into redistricting and the voting rights.
Well, this is Leroy Johnson from Mississippi. I want to say to Attorney Thompson that I call it Robeson County too. When I first started coming over to Robeson County with the Lumbe tribe with Donald Chavez and those folks, we call it Robeson County. So I was trying to figure out what was the difference between Robeson and Robinson.
It's our name. We pronounce it as we want it.
That's right. That's all I'm just saying. I got introduced the other way, so I'm good. I'm just good. I just want to make sure I'm in the right place, where I get started. The context for me was getting into the voting rights and redistricting is I got thrown into the idea of my dad deciding to run for commissioner, county commissioner. And I was away in grad school, and he asked me to come back and run his campaign because he said he couldn't win with the old heads, as he said. He needed to have young people to vote for him in order to win, because the old heads was tied to the plantation system in the Delta, Mississippi. And so his whole question was, I can't win with the old heads, I gotta win with new people, right? And he said, and since you made our home the home of everybody in your class, right? And not in your class, they would come home and play with us out in the field, and we play softball, we play baseball, we play football, and we played basketball, and everybody would come home and with me, but they didn't understand the reason they were coming home with me was so they could get some of my mama's cooking. It had nothing to do with the games we were playing. It was like, okay, when we get home, we get you to eat some of Miss Johnson cooking. So it was that as the answer. It was my mom cooking that drew all the folks to the house. It wasn't me, right? But he decided to run for office, and I came back and ran his campaign, and we won. It was a successful campaign, and he won for a county commissioner. I left and went back to grad school. I took a semester off and came back and went back to grad school at the University of Michigan. And something happened, and I had an epiphany, and I decided I wanted to go back home. Right, my dad told me I should have never left. Right, because my dad was a member of SNCC, and I tell folks I was a lap and palate baby of the civil rights movement, because I went from lap to lap or from palate to palate. Right, so I laid in the corner and went to sleep, or I went to sleep in somebody's lap, some wonderful person's lap, like Fannie Lou Hamer. So it was one of those kind of things. And so through osmosis, I got this, right, as a part of this process. And so I left and I came back, and I had this epiphany that said, you need to go home, right? And I did come home, and I decided to work and to do some volunteer work for a community-based organization that was working in the county, as I worked with other folk to, so it could pay for me doing volunteer work, right, as a part of the process. And so, so the first job I took as an organizer was jails and courts organizer, right? And I turned this idea of jails and courts organizer with a local organization into youth organizer, right? Because most of the folks I would deal with in jails and courts were the young people, right? And so there were so many young people going through the court system, and the first thing I needed to do was to deal with them inside of a process. And so I became a youth organizer. And one of the things I found out was that I needed to do something about how they were running a bank off of the young people in my community, right? And so every time they would go through town, they would stop them for something, give them a fine for this and a fine for this and a fine for this and a fine for that. And I kept bumping heads with the local folk, and I was like, you know, we need some Black folk on this board. So tired of talking with these white folk about this mess, you know, about us, you know. And that was when I made a decision that I wanted to figure out how to do how to get engaged in this in a very kind of different kind of way in terms of voting rights, and also how to look at making sure that Black folk could win, because they couldn't win at these at-large programs, right? Because that was the first thing I learned. And so I spent some time at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and inside of that time with the Center for Constitutional Rights, it was inside that process where I began to think about how to go from an at-large system to award system to apportionment as a part of the process.
Thank you both. So to continue on in the thread of just the trajectory, you know, Leroy, you laid out just like the civil rights, the SNCC context. Can we talk a bit more about the Voting Rights Act and how both of you were able to leverage the Voting Rights Act to achieve, you know, some semblance of fair redistricting?
Leroy, do you want to go first or me? Let me just say this.
You go ahead on.
I think she was asking you, Leroy. You go ahead.
Okay. So let me say, one of the things, just a little small side story. I got into it with the Center for Constitutional Rights, and so I got a VW bus, a Volkswagen bus, and I took a bunch of folk from the Mississippi Delta to New York City on this VW bus. And when we got to the New Jersey Turnpike, the bus broke down. And so we went on Channel 1 News pushing the VW bus down the New Jersey Turnpike. And I was going to to demonstrate against the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. So I was like, New York City, and we're gonna go. And so the Channel 1 News wanted to understand why were these ragtag group of folks from Mississippi talking about going to New York City to demonstrate in front of the offices of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And the Center for Constitutional Rights had told me that that Victor McTeer, who was one of their star attorneys for the center, associate attorney for the center for Mississippi, and he was doing all Mississippi cases. And I had talked to Victor about doing some voting rights cases for us in Holmes County. And Victor told me, you know, that if he was going to do it, he was going to have to be in control. And he had laid out a whole bunch of stuff. And I told him, I said, you know, my folk need some training. We don't need to be told what to do. We need some training so we understand how to move this process. I said, because we had to deal with what the process is rather than just being told and you just do what you want to do, right? And so I fired Victor, and he told me I couldn't fire him. And so he told me that the only folk could fire him were the folks from New York City. So I went to New York City so I could get him fired, right? And inside of that, built a kind of respectful kind of relationship with the center that we could have these kind of conversations, right? And so we started these conversations about with the three founders of the center, Kennard Chavis, and Consular. And it was inside that discussion that I began to understand what the Voting Rights Act actually did and what it was there for, right? And so having those kind of constitutional minds, attorneys with those kind of constitutional minds, laying out to me and to the folk I was with, who I brought with me as a part of that community of folk, we were brought in and immersed inside of a discussion around the Voting Rights Act, right? And what it meant, right? And we went through all 5 sections of it: Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4, Section 5, right? And we understood that Mississippi, all of Mississippi, was under the jurisdictional part, which is Section 4, which then made Section 5 the pilot by which we could then do our work, because everything that Mississippi had to do around voting rights had to be sent to the Justice Department or to the federal courts, right, in DC. And so, and then what they were saying to us is, here's the opening, right? Mississippi, all of Mississippi, you ain't got to worry about Mississippi. You ain't got to worry about where and how, everything in Mississippi. Y'all are just bad people doing bad things, right? And so it was one of those things that was the understanding that we had. And so the abilities to say, how do we draw lines that get us to that kind of fair redistricting that gets us to a position where we could have a candidate of our choice win, was inside of those discussions. And so I learned it to a degree that the Senate hired me to work in 12 counties in the Mississippi Delta to teach others how to do, to use the Voting Rights Act to do redistricting, right? And we wrote the first small manual on how to use community lawyering to do voting rights and to do redistricting, right? And it's the first manual that the Center for Constitutional Rights ever did, and I find my name all over it. I don't know why, but somehow or another my name ended up all over it as a part of their looking at the Mississippi Delta as the avenue by which they were going to be teaching the voting rights and teaching how to do fair redistricting.
Thank you, Leroy. You know, anybody that pushes a van down the New Jersey Turnpike deserves more than honorable mention. That's how your name is all over the book. Look, let me just say this. You know,
I was young and crazy.
Look, let me say this too. I'm a 1974 graduate of Morehouse College. So my first voting was actually in Atlanta, Georgia. So I know a little bit about Atlanta. And then when I graduated from Morehouse, I went to North Carolina Central Law School. And I graduated from Central in 1977. And in 2 years or 3 years, I became general counsel of the NAACP. I just wanted to fill in that gap. I had the pleasure of associating with William Kunstler, Attorney Kunstler out of New York, Leroy, when I became public defender in the Eddie Hatcher case. Yeah. That was the case involving the takeover of the local newspaper. Great lawyer.
Okay.
Yeah. That's interesting. Let me. I think this will be helpful. As general counsel of the NAACP, well, first of all, Reggie told me to take off the lawyer's hat, in which I'm glad to do that because I've been retired now from public defender's office since 2016. I haven't been doing a whole lot of lawyering, attorney work, but the NAACP, when I became general counsel, and I have to give some credit to Carolyn Coleman, we had NAACP was structured so that you have a field director. The field director in the NAACP organization actually is the organizer, you know, and you mentioned how you as an organizer had to write a training manual for attorneys involving, you know, attorneys in the voting rights community. And I understand exactly what you mean. And I think that this audience needs to understand Angus Thompson was never a community organizer. I had the pleasure of Carolyn Coleman as an NAACP North Carolina State Field Director going into communities. And when we brought voting rights lawsuits, we were changing the methods of elections from at-large elections to what we call district and you call ward elections or hybrids, so that we could get representatives of our choice elected to, these body politics. And we filed several lawsuits. The first lawsuit actually we filed was when I was general counsel, was in Pasquotank County. Y'all ever heard of Pasquotank County? That's where Elizabeth City State University is located. That's been in the news lately. And Ron Penny, I actually had a committee of 5 attorneys across the state. One was Ramalis Murphy and since this is North Carolina, I think you all need to know this. It's a little North Carolina history, not Mississippi history. But Ramalis Murphy, who was deceased, he was associate general counsel. He was out of Greensboro. We had a committee of 5 attorneys. There was Donnie Hoover, Attorney Hoover out of Charlotte, who became a district court judge, and Ronald Penny, attorney out of Elizabeth City, Pasquotank County. Then there was Attorney Paul Jones, who was a retired Superior Court judge out of Kinston. And then there was yours truly, Angus Thompson, general counsel. So we had a statewide committee of lawyers, but the organizer was Carolyn Coleman. And before we brought a lawsuit, we had, I guess, maybe 6 or 7 lawsuits that were brought in the 80s, that when I was general counsel, in NAACP lawsuits. The community organizers always went in first. You don't send lawyers in to organize your community. You send community organizers, okay? And that's so important. That's the first thing. And so I'm not an organizer, but I was an attorney. And that speaks volume, because once you understand that your community has to be trained, your lawyers have to be trained, and they have to be educated. They've got to be educated. That's what training is about. And so that they understand what the issues are, and you have to train them in a language that they understand so that they also become advocates. Because advocacy is so much and so important when you're dealing with redistricting or any political kind of issue. So I wanted to ditto that and put that into context. But that's how you become, you grow coalitions. See, organization of a community creates coalitions. It creates coalitions among other organizations in the communities. And in Robeson County, it created an organization that transcended race. We organized around issues. LA, communities of interest and community interest. That's important. And you ended your last session on that. And folks, let me tell you, that's what this is about. Because until you can get communities of interest, and you're going to have a hard time forming a coalition. Coalitions are built around interest. And I was telling LA earlier, there's an old saying, when politics, I have no permanent friends, but I have permanent interests. I'm not so sure that's true anymore. You may not have permanent friends, and you may not have permanent interests, because interests change. But that's important, that we understand that to build coalitions, you have to build communities of interest.
That's powerful. And if we could elaborate on the communities of interest piece a bit more, if we could stay there a minute, I think it'd be great for folks, who were able to tune in. We've had the past month, as Reggie stated, of virtual trainings, getting, people, our folks thank y'all for attending tonight. But, various experts at different levels. Some folks who've tuned in are novices to redistricting, and some a bit more expert level. But thinking around the notions of community interest, what does that look like, Attorney Thompson? And then the question after that to you, Commissioner Johnson, is the question around how are y'all able to double the African American caucus? I kind of want to give you that one specifically after Attorney Thompson elaborates a bit more on the community.
Well, I want to talk about then and now. Then was a lot better than it is now. Back when in the 80s and the 70s, the Robeson County is a well, it was considered triracial then. Obviously, we have now Hispanics, Latinos who are an important part of this community, and others, Asians. But primarily, we were dealing with Native Americans, Indians, who are Indians, and Caucasians, whites, and Negroes, who blacks, African Americans. And the communities of interest back then was there was, it's interesting because it's almost like we reliving it. Corruption and a needed reform in the criminal justice system, police brutality. Is that familiar in 2021? We also had a school merger, and we merged 5 school systems. And the reason it transcended race is because the school systems in Robeson County, there were like 5 school systems or school districts that were in different locales, Lumberton, for example, Fairmount, St. Paul's, Red Springs, and then there was a county-wide system. Well, whites controlled the city school systems, and the city school systems really had the money, and you could actually vote. We had to get rid of double voting. City folks could vote in the county school system for their board, but the county folks couldn't vote for the city board of board members. So there was a double voting lawsuit, so there was also inequities in the system. Now we're talking about post desegregation now. We're not even talking about doing segregation. We're talking about and the 70s. And so there was a community of interest in merging. There were whites in the counties, rural folks who otherwise the only interest you had was working for them, in the tobacco field or cotton field. But when we were talking about education, they were getting a little bit of what everybody was getting in the county. We were just getting a poor a deal. So that was a community of interest. And then the criminal justice system reform. That was a community of interest because minorities were being mistreated. And let me say this, when I say minorities, let me tell you somebody else who was being mistreated. Poor whites. See, class and race has always been an issue. And when class, when you black, you got a double whammy. You poor and you black. But poor whites were being mistreated in the criminal justice system, just like they were being mistreated in the educational systems because of the lack of funding. So those were 2 examples of community of interest that we were able to transcend race and form coalitions. So does that sort of give you a context?
That was perfect. That was perfect. Right. I know we talk about this, right? We chop it up about, communities of interest. And that term is in, the guidelines that our legislators here in the state they're suggested to follow. Like one of the things they have to do, and we talked about this during this training over the past few weeks, is that, some of the guidelines are, the map has to be contiguous. It has to be compact. But one of the other things is communities of interest should be considered, but we need to really think through, like what you just laid out for us, what is a community of interest?
Right.
And like
let me say this, that was then, and let me just give you a little bit of now. The problem we have now is exactly how you explained it in your last session, cracking, packing, stacking, hijacking, and kidnapping. You know, hey, you brought me from civil. I never heard of civil larceny, but I know about criminal larceny. And so what they did in the latter redistrictings is they cracked this community, and they cracked the communities of interest, and that affected the coalitions. And you can see that in your district maps. Native Americans were packed. Cheryl Powell, who was, I think she's on tonight, but she explained that in that last session. She was in that group 3, and she mentioned how, once they changed redistricting, once they had reapportionment, the last reapportionment, part of the southern part of the county was included in another part of the county, now Republican, and they went to the state legislature and they closed the door on them. That would never happen in 1970 or 1980 in this county. So when they cracked us, they didn't only crack us, they smacked us.
They diluted the power. And Commissioner Johnson, I'm gonna turn it to you. Any elaboration you want to talk about, the communities of interest, the guidelines, but I definitely want you to pull in, just how the work that y'all did to double the African American Caucus. And correct me how I say it, y'all also conducted listening and hearing tours. Did I get that order right?
Yeah, we had listening tours. We did all over the state. In Mississippi, there's 82 counties. We went to 65 of those counties over a 6-week period of time, right? 3 organizers, right? And we split those 65 counties up between the 3 of us. And we did a 6-week listening tour. Every week we had a group of counties that we would have a series of meetings in. And then on Fridays, we would get together in Holmes County at the big truck stop restaurant, and we had a table to ourselves in the back of the truck stop restaurant where we would meet and debrief about what took place in those counties that we visited that week, right? And the meetings that we had during that period of time. And so, it was so 65, there was 65 counties, and each one of those counties had at least 25% African American community, right? And we went to the African American community in all of those 65 counties, right? And we talked to them about what's wrong in your community. And they laid out a bunch of different things that were wrong, right? They said no jobs, lack of housing, poor housing, bad education, worse education, and they mentioned the other thing which was interesting. They mentioned this whole question of healthcare, right? That not being able to have doctors in rural places, and most of Mississippi is rural, and so they were talking about that as an issue, right? And we told them, after they told us what the issue was, we connected redistricting to their issue.
There you go.
Right? So the question is, who control jobs? Who control education? Right? Who control housing? Right? And we said, if you had people in office who think like you, who work like you, who see the things that you see, then you have a chance of getting them to bring these things into your community, right? And so we spent 6 weeks doing that to that 65 communities, right? right? We listened, we talked to them, we heard everything they had to say. And then we turned back around and did we did 9 weeks the second time around to say, okay, here's how we get all of this. We connected it together with you the first time. Now let's talk about how we can make this happen, right? How we can do this, right? And they were like, we don't know nothing about redistricting. How do we get engaged in this? How do we make this process work? It can't work. We don't know enough to be engaged in this. We just don't know. And one of the things that we helped them to see in that 9-week tour was how they were experts. We told them nobody knows what's going on in Laurel, Mississippi, but Black folk across the track in Laurel, Mississippi, right? I don't care who we bring in as an expert witness about the demographics of your community, right? In that area, right? And I don't care who they are, they don't know as much about it as you do. Let me give you a perfect example. In Holmes County, Mississippi, right? Holmes County, down in the bottom, right? You think the bottom is 100% Black, right? But in the bottom, being 100% Black, 50% of the 100% Black are Jehovah's Witnesses. So we know that the Jehovah's Witnesses in the bottom ain't gonna vote. You can't make them vote, you can't drag them to vote, right. You can't law them to vote. I don't care how many amens and hoop the hoops you do, they ain't gonna vote.
That's right.
Right? Because they're waiting. I don't know what they're waiting on, but they're waiting. And I'm glad they're waiting. And I'm good with them, you know, but as I said, I even go to the Kingdom Hall and I'm with them, but I ain't gonna be waiting on you to vote, right? So there's enough folk in the bottom to make a district, to make a precinct. But if you wanna win that, you're gonna have to put the bottom with the circle, right? With Murrayberry Circle, because the Black folk on Murrayberry Circle gonna vote. So if you want to win, you got to put the circle with the bottom, because the bottom by itself ain't gonna win it for you. So if you take 4 of the streets in the bottom, because there's 8 streets in the bottom, and you take those 4 streets and put them with the circle, you can win. But you can't win with, and so somebody from outside, if they come in, we bringing in because the Lawyers Committee and Frank Parker, who wrote Black Vote Count, which is a wonderful attorney, and I knew Frank, and we were great friends, but he was gonna bring Alex Bullingham to come down and be the special witness, you know, to be the expert witness, and Alex was gonna lay out all of this wonderful demographics and all that stuff, but Alex ain't know nothing about the Jehovah's Witnesses in the bottom.
There you go.
You see, they don't know nothing about Jehovah's Witnesses in the bottom, but the folk in the bottom know about that, and they're experts about the bottom. And so what we would say to the community is, you're experts. Nobody knows what you know. As wonderful as Alex was, and Alex taught me how to be an expert witness. Let me just be clear. Alex taught me how to be an expert witness. Frank Parker taught me how to be an expert witness, right? But at the same time, I could talk about my stuff about my communities, but I couldn't talk about other folks' stuff about their communities. And so we did those 15 weeks all together to make sure that folk understood that and that they could learn these technical issues. And one of the things that we would talk to them about was communities of interest. One of the things we talked to them about was compactness. One of those things that we talked to them about was contiguousness. One of those things we talked to them about, and we made a manual, right? So we made a bigger manual of the manual that I wrote for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And we put a bigger manual together and gave that manual to the communities, and we did trainings with them around the manual, right? So the good part about it is the 2 people who helped me write the manual for the Center for Constitutional Rights, one of which was a lawyer, also helped me to write the manual that we did and they helped me start Southern Echo, right? So Hollis Watkins and Mike Sayre, who both had been members of SNCC, and Mike was a white lawyer out of New York City, right? Who had worked for the Center for Constitutional Rights here early on as a part of the process. And so, and he also worked in the Chicago 7 case with the center. And so these two other individuals worked with me, and we wrote a manual, and we put that manual inside a community, and we did trainings with communities around that, inside that 9-week period, right? We put it, and inside of that, we also put maps, local maps, right? We pulled local maps, we pulled all of the precinct maps, we used all of the data that the state had, and we pulled all that information together, and we provided it inside of those manuals. And so when we had the idea of having, and the other piece that was so important to this was organizing around the Joint Legislative Committee for Reapportionment, right? And, you know, Mississippi gonna have co-chairs, and they're gonna have a white chair, a white co-chair, and a black co-chair, right? And the black co-chair actually was Robert Clark from Holmes County, right? And he was the first African-American elected to the state legislature since Reconstruction, right? And he came out of Holmes County, Mississippi. And so Robert was the favorite co-chair for the reapportionment committee, right? But Robert was weak. He started off strong as you could be, but the longer he stayed in the legislature, the weaker he got. And so they knew that Robert was going to, because we were asking for only 7 additional districts. That's all we were asking for, right? Now we had 21 and 91, and we were asking for 7 more to get to 28. But the more we met with people and talked to them, they kept saying, we can get more, because I know how to do this, and I know the people over here, and we can work together. And so it was bringing the NAACP, it was bringing the Voter League, it was bringing folk who were working on education issues. So we built all these wonderful coalitions all across the state, right? And as they fought us, the longer they fought us, the more we learned.
Somebody needs to be
by doing
muted.
Organizing work. And it was inside that organizing work that changed our abilities to get at it, right? And so we forced Robert Clark. I brought Robert Clark's entire campaign committee to sit down at 7:30 in the morning in the committee room, and we filled up the committee room from Holmes County with his campaign folk, the head of his campaign and the rest of his campaign committee, along with Holmes County citizens sitting on the front row all the way back through the door. And they had to ask us to let them get into their room to sit down, right? Into their legislative room to sit down. And we made Robert Clark the strongest co-chair they had ever had in the state legislature. We got a black attorney for to be the co-chair of the attorneys for the board for the state. And it was inside of forcing Robert, because he said, I ain't gonna never turn against my people. I ain't gonna never sell them out. I ain't gonna never do that. And he was selling them out left and right before that. But when they sit down there in front of him, I don't believe Robert would do that. That's what the lady told me. His campaign chair said, I just don't believe Robert would do that. He wouldn't do that. I helped that. Oh, no, you can't do that. And I said her right there in front, right? And every time his mouth opened, she was looking right down, dead through it, right? And it was inside of that process that forced him to become the strongest co-chair of the committee that they have ever had before. And he stood tall, and he forced them to give. This was the same one that the white folks loved and said, we can work with Robert, we can work with Robert. Midway through the process, they said, what happened to Robert? What's wrong with him? He won't accept nothing we put forward. What's wrong with him? And his people were sitting right there, that was what was wrong with it, right? It made him have a backbone. Because my granddaddy said, boy, you can't have a gristle all your life. You're gonna have to grow a backbone. And so the idea is that we made Robert Clark grow a backbone, and he held strong inside of those committees. And so that gave us an opportunity to then be part of all of the hearings that we had. And we were bringing folks to every hearing, and we would have our folks in the hearing, and they would open up their manual and say, here's what it says, here's what y'all gotta do, this is what we expect from you, nothing else, nothing less, right? And it was inside that process that drove the state wild. And so for the last final hearings, they had all of the hearings on the same day. But they were flying from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi to Jackson, to the North Mississippi, all the way up to the Memphis, Tennessee line. And every meeting, right, these 3 grand meetings that they had on the same day, we filled them up, and folk was talking from the hymnal, which was their training manual. And they run all over them as a part of the process. And so the head of the Legislative Black Caucus, we got so good at Legislative Black Caucus, the head of the Legislative Black Caucus told us, y'all wrong, this reverse racism. It took us, this is what he said, it took us 25 years to get 21 in the Legislative Black Caucus. And now y'all trying to double it in one election. That's wrong, that's reverse racism against the white folk at the state capitol. He started like, he'd be like, I go cry or something, you know? And we were like, cry, right? Cry. And we had his campaign chair take him to fishing and told him that if he didn't close his mouth, they're gonna throw him over in the Mississippi River. But you know, that you can't talk about that though. Don't y'all tell them about it, right? That we threatened to chair the Legislative Black Caucus. We didn't do it, but his campaign chair did threaten him, right? Told him to shut up and let it happen, right? Let the community speak as a part of the process. And so, you know, what happened was that we told communities, if you build a house, right, it makes you the landlord. Landlords decide who goes in the house, right? And that the district don't belong to the candidate, that the district belong to the community. And you know how black folk is. If you in my, don't you be tearing up my house. I can't have the wrong people in my house. No, you ain't right. No, you ain't gonna pay me. And so, you know, we be clear about who's gonna be in our houses, right? And so that was the thing that we put forward, right? We put forward that if community builds the house, then the community ought to be the one who determine who's in the house. And what that did was it doubled the size of the Legislative Black Caucus in one election from 21 to 42. And we had the highest voter turnout in the history of the state of Mississippi up until Obama in 2012, right? We beat Obama in 2008, but he beat us in 2012, right? In terms of the black turnout in Mississippi, was the highest had ever been was in the 92 and 95 elections in Mississippi. In 91, we doubled it from 41 to 42, and 95 in the regular election, the special election in 92, we doubled it. And then in 1995, we went from 45, we went to 45. So it was 42 and 92 and 45 and 95. All them things rhyme, must be one of them Jesse Jackson things, I don't know. But that was one of the things that's how it happened. That's what we were able to do, but it happened because communities came together. We organized communities, we built communities of interest, and folk began to connect with one another. Because one of the things that we found in the process, in organizing that process, is that folk in Mississippi didn't spend a lot of time across the county line. They didn't spend a lot of time across the county line, right? They were housed inside of a county line, and at the county line was a demarcation of a fence line, and they stayed inside of their fence line, right? Because white folks told them they needed to know where they were, right? Stay in your place, be in your place, and be in your place when I tell you to be in your place, right? And so this whole idea of traveling across county lines was new to them, right? Because they always was in competition with from one county to the other. And you know, and the only time they crossed county lines was for football, basketball, baseball, you know, track, some kind of sports events, right? And they couldn't stand each other, right? Because of the sports events. And so the idea of putting them together across these processes created relationships across county lines and created coalitions so that we could put districts together and put you know, these processes together so that we could build the types of communities of interest that could change things. And so the being able to do that was the deal. And when folks said we can make a difference, and they saw that they could actually make the house, and they could then put the folk they wanted in the house, right? Because they build them through the redistricting process, and then they voted for those folks that they wanted inside of the house. And so we were able to double that because of that. And it was a wonderful thing to see that happen. It was a wonderful thing to see communities come together. And you know, now it is we drew 50 the Justice Department, we drew 50 legislative black districts, right? And the Justice Department wanted to know how we could draw the maximum number of legislative black districts. They had their specialists to look at it, and they said that there's no way that the maximum number that the state of Mississippi could have was 50. We drew all 50 of those districts in 1991. And we won all 50 of them in 2007, right? The same district we drew in 91 were the same districts that we had 50 black folks to win in 2007, right? But it came about by doing that 15 weeks and pulling folks together and helping to build communities of interest and organizing folks from being in competition to being together. And it had so many things that held them together that they never thought about as a part of the process. Lodges, you know, they had, you know, all those things, and they didn't even think about it. And so we helped them to remember who they were, right? Masonic lodges, we have folks to remember who they were. And they always met together in these church things, right? Other part of the process, and how they were communities of interest, right? And so they had these district meetings, right? And they had these conventions and all that kind of stuff. And they never thought about how to use that as ways to talk about communities of interest. And we helped them to remember who they were and how they could use that to kind of a little bit long, but that's the story of 21 to 42 and 42 to 45, and then 50 in 2007.
That's incredible. And before I give some comment, I see Attorney Thompson is about to come in, and I'll comment and kind of reflect and react. But
right, thank you. You know, Mr. Johnson, if I can call you Leroy, look, let me tell you something.
You can call me Leroy.
Experts are who make good attorneys. Did y'all see that George Floyd case? Experts make good attorneys.
Yes.
Now I was listening to what you were saying, and it's so instructive. You open up by mentioning Donna Chavis from Robeson County. Now, Southern Echo was the equivalent of the Center for Community Action here in Robeson County. Now, I don't know whether you were training them or they were training you, but that was the same equivalent. And you're so right. When I opened up about communities of interest, you expanded on it. And what you will find when you get communities involved and you get organizers who can get people not just to you know, they got to show up and they got to show out. And that's what organizers would do for communities. And when you bring communities together, which means you got to show up, you got to meet. And then
Yes.
when you meet new people, these are relationships. You'll find that you have more in common sometimes than you have not in common. And so you'll find more interest. But you got to show up first. And that's what community organizers do. Now, and that's what you did. And I don't know, again, whether you, Donna's husband is Mike Legerton, who ran the Center for Director for Community Action in Robeson County. So you must know something about it.
Really quick. Look, Leroy, I'll pass it to you. Leroy, I'm telling you, this is why I got y'all up here. Because Southern Echo trained, I'm going to say it. Southern Echo, that model, see that, look how powerful that imprint is. Angus like remembered and recognized that strategic organizing plan because you can't beat it. You can't beat us. You can't beat us. And so Southern Echo and Leroy trained Reverend Legerton and Donna Chavis and brought it here, y'all. Like it's the connection. Like I know we're hearing, Mississippi wins, but the Mississippi wins organizing informed the wins in Robeson County. That's just powerful. I want us to kind of rest in that for a moment.
And also, it was interesting. You talked about
Mac and Donald was cool.
Yeah, you talked about the state legislature because that's a dynamic. Henry Fry was the first out of Greensboro, who was also ended up being our Chief Justice, but he was the first African American elected to the North Carolina state legislature. That's an urban area, Greensboro, North Carolina. That's Guilford County. But guess who was second the next year? Joy Johnson out of Robeson County. Only the first two African Americans to serve in the North Carolina State General Assembly. Now, in Robeson County Joy Johnson couldn't have gotten elected without Native Americans and some whites. But that was a dynamic of North Carolina politics. Right. And when we brought those voting rights lawsuits in these local body politics, and you started getting city councilmen and town commissioners elected, then you started getting legislative districts drawn and legislators elected, African Americans. And so you build a house from the bottom up, not from the top down.
And something I will say, I know we're about to, we're inching towards 8 o'clock. And so I'm going to ask y'all a few remaining comments. And if folks have questions, right, we'll take some limited questions. Y'all getting to listen to the front porch conversation, the stoop combo. So, we may take some questions, but I feel like a lot was answered. If you was listening, a lot was answered tonight. And I do want to ground, we have heard how to use guidelines like contingency, compactness, and communities of interest. One of my favorite things. And I consider, Angus, Leroy, both of you, I consider y'all my mentors, period. That's why I know communities of interest the way that I do and get better at it every day because of y'all, right? Sitting in Panera Bread, Angus, talking, or Leroy, us in Mississippi. I want y'all to know something. My whole family went to Mississippi before pandemic. And Leroy and his family took us in. And Southern Echo, they tried to show me how to draw maps with crayons, pens, and a piece of paper. There were children in there, y'all. Children who knew how to draw maps by hand. This is a secret that maybe I shouldn't be telling it, but I looked around and I'm looking at teenagers over here beating me, talking about we're going to take Black voting age population and we're going to subtract it, then divide it. I was like, woo, demographers, math in their heads. And so, I consider y'all mentors, but this is a master class. This is information that you couldn't get at a graduate level nowhere. Let me just really ground it. What y'all have got tonight, y'all have got an organizing strategy from the ground up. You got the nuts and bolts. You've heard the litigation side, the legislation side, paired with the organizing side, because you can't have either without or, both. It has to be both and. You've heard the community. And also want to ground, it's not a sprint. When you're hearing that, all these community tours, these listening and hearing, and Leroy, you said something, how you say it, I know you're listening, but do you hear me? And that's what I remember you saying that. But
do you hear me?
Yeah, and I want to ground that what they did is a lot of times we see organizations treat redistricting as a one-off. It's not. And the kind of labor that both of you have done to visit communities, to litigate on behalf of communities, to actually map out entire states, to visit almost all counties, that's the power. That's the people power. But it's also telling your folks, y'all are the experts. And people try to devalue us, right? They try to ambush, bamboozle us from knowing who we are. But for y'all to go in and say, this is who you are, remember who you are, and this is how we're gonna do it. And then it's done. You can't beat it. So I just want to say, I hope folks had notepads and pens out. We're recording it, we'll share it, but y'all just got a masterclass tonight. As we wind down, what I would like for folks to hear in closing is, today is, and Angus, you took us there. Today is a little bit different, right? Voting Rights Act, some parts have been gutted by Supreme Court, and that changes some dynamics. We talked about that a little bit, pre-clearance, states not having to prove that their districts aren't, racist to the federal level, but that has created some impact. So Voting Rights Act is a little different this day and age, right? But it's still the same issues, it's still the same impact. So any advice, any thoughts of what's to come, just anything I want to leave with folks as they're thinking about solutions to old problems, but not reinventing the wheel at the same time. Any feedback?
Well,
Well,
I'm certainly not don't consider myself an expert. I'm just a lawyer, and I tell you, we hire experts. Clients pay for them, but we hire them. But clients pay for them. That's sort of the fee. But the dynamics have changed so today in a number of ways. There is a generational divide. Well, I'm not sure whether we didn't have it then. I mean, you had youth who, I think the youth movement is so important. And you started out with that, Leroy. Young folks can think a lot differently than
yes.
some older folks. I told Reggie, I'm going to share this. I mentioned this, and I think this is important because I'm so proud of our young attorneys and the young organizers today. Been there, done that, but it's like a team sport. Young people are energetic, they're competitive. And a young lawyer, I told him I always like a young lawyer because a young lawyer is like a young player in a team sport. He want to show an old player how he can kick his ass. So I mean, that's the kind of energy we need, and that's what you had to do to that. The chairman of that, I believe it was the caucus, legislative caucus. You have to push us.
Yes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah. But I believe that in the new redistricting, that the divide that you have in the Republican Party now, I think that's a dynamic we've got to deal with. And you can take advantage of division, and division, we've got to. They've been cracked a little, and the I think the most difficult part of a dynamic and from a political standpoint is how those divisions, you can take advantage of those divisions when we're drawing districts and reapportionment and Republican controlled legislatures, how you can use that to your advantage. And I don't say you can't, just find out how you can. Because I believe there's some ways that you can use that. You have moderates, you have the right, and hey, they cracked us, maybe we need to crack them. Think about cracking them, and in the primaries, you got some of these far right folks, maybe that plays out where we'll win in the in the general elections, but the districts are going to, in Republican controlled legislatures, it's going to be an uphill battle. But don't say we can't, but we can. And the interests, again, community of interests make the difference. You find out what those interests are, and they're more than, and they cross Republican and Democratic lines. You know, and that to me, communities of interest is where we need to be focusing on. Find the interest, find not what divides us, but what unites us, and across party lines. And have some youth in there. We need to. Hey, I go along with bring some youth, some young players, and the old players. Hey, they fighting for to keep their positions, but I'm gonna tell you, you know, you got to retire sometime. That's all over.
That is very tough. Thanks, Leroy.
Oh, I guess. Yeah, I would say that communities coming together and coming onto the playing field is the only place that we have now in terms of Section 4 and Section 5, right? Section 4 is jurisdictions, right? Section 4 named out all of the jurisdictions that had to do pre-clearance, right? And then Section 5 was pre-clearance. The only folk who can do Section 4 and Section 5 now is communities, right? Communities got to be on the playing field. Young people got to be on the playing field, right? You got to be going to these places, because they still got to have hearings around redistricting. That's still in the law, right? The jingle factors are still the jingle factors, right? They're still there, right? And so they got to have hearings. They got to show you maps. They got to do all these things. And so we're more technologically advanced, and so we can still draw alternative maps, right? But the beauty of drawing alternative maps is it teaches you how to be engaged in the process. And so you still got Section 2, and the whole country is under Section 2. And if you can show them inside of your work right now, right, in terms of community of interest, if you are on the playing field and you saying, okay, I'm telling you that these precincts right here needs to be together because these are communities of interest, right? And you can't crack these communities of interest, right? And you draw maps that shows that these communities of interest should be together, and then they do the opposite of that, then that's a Section 2 setup. Because you then shown them that you ain't caring about whether or not this is about those communities of interest. This is about you, right? And so taking the opportunity to crack them, right? Because again, if you can take and put all of the crazy white folk, right? The crazy ones. I'm talking about the far right who fell off the cliff, fell on the ground, rolled over, and said, "Oh, I didn't die." Them ones, right? Put them all in one group, right? Put them in one group, right? And let them be by themselves. You can then check the rest of them and try to put. We went to the in 2012. We went to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Robert told us, "Don't be coming up to him with no POCs." People of color communities, right? People of color of interest, right? He told us that there's no such thing of people of color. You got to tell me you're Black, you're Hispanic, you this or that. Don't be telling me that you're talking about POCs, right? Because there's no such thing as POCs. And so I'm saying that there is such thing as people of color communities of interest. And so when you can find those places where we can pull together the Latino community, and you can pull together the Native community, you can pull together the Black community, you can pull together the right white folk, right, who are trying to figure out how to stop being civil warriors. I tell them they're civil warriors. They still, because the South said they would never surrender, right? And so we still got folks who are fighting the Civil War, right? And so those are the ones that fell off the cliff, rolled over, and still said I'm still living. So those are the ones who were running around during the insurrection with the rebel flags in the rotunda of the House, right, in the Senate. And so all I'm saying is that we got to figure out how to do that. And the place we can do that is with communities coming together and pulling together and saying, we're going to hold you to these standards, right? And they're going to wish they had never got rid of Section 4, because if community rises up and comes to all of those meetings and become a part of all of the discussions around it, and saying, here's the rules that you need to be following, and asking them to follow those rules, and being in there when they're doing it, the joint legislative committees are putting the committees together, saying, these are the people we want on these committees. These are the people that should be a part of that. And if our legislative caucuses would join with community and stop trying to run that they know more than everybody else games, we would be in a much better place, right? And they done taught us they don't know more than we do, right? But let us be part of a process that guides us so we work together. And I think this will bring us together in ways that will allow us to then challenge anything they do. If people are in the room, it changes the dialogue when people are in the room. And especially when young people are in the room, because they're scared, they don't know what they're gonna do, right? And that's good for us, right? That's a good thing for us, because they don't know what they're gonna pop off and say and what they're gonna pop off and do. And so I think that's a good thing, and that's, we use that, as a part of our own understanding and our own strategy, right? Look, I tell everybody in my training that every strategy ain't strategic. It's just a strategy, right? What makes it strategic is whether it works or not, right? And so that's one of the things we got to be dealing with. Let's talk about putting together strategies, but let's talk about being strategic in the process.
Mercy. Oh, goodness. Attorney Thompson, Commissioner Johnson, I am full. And I know we have 4 minutes, and I'll turn over to Reggie to close out in a moment. But we definitely, again, Code Red, North Carolina Black Alliance, we've heard, different parties, and we do want to ground to disclosure, we're 501c3, so we're nonpartisan as an org, but what you're hearing is history in this space and not a preference of party affiliation. So I just want to ground that. And then last, if there's a question, we can take at least one question. If someone has a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat or closing out. But as you're dropping your question, I just want to say thank you to Attorney Angus Thompson, and thank you to Commissioner Leroy Johnson. I I know I called both of y'all. I was like, can y'all get him? Y'all was like, well, y'all did it. Y'all, I appreciate y'all always supporting me and my ideas. And it's so full, it's so rich, and it's just honoring y'all. We always talk about giving flowers. Well, we got to do that from. And I just want to give you both flowers. The elders that are on this call are listening. I also want to recognize y'all because this is what we do as a people. We're a village. And I just appreciate y'all creating this village and this front porch in a virtual space. But thank you for telling the strategy. Thank you for not, charging us a fee just to hear how to fight for liberation, because some people do it. We know it. But thank you for doing that, and just appreciate y'all, love y'all, honor y'all. And so with that, in 2 minutes, again, thank you. Reggie, I'll turn it over to you to close us out and to also give folks information for our next training. I know this was like a kind of impromptu discussion because we can't talk about training and we can't talk about history if we're not bringing the folks in that made that history. That's disrespectful. It's not honoring them. And so that's what tonight was about. So we just appreciate y'all coming in with us to honor folks. And so Reggie, I'll turn it over to you, and thank y'all again for tuning in tonight.